Vegas has spoken, and Joe Flacco has the best odds to start for the Browns week 1. I agree, and I'll tell you why. Coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast, and proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. Our friends at FanDuel have their odds out for who the Browns starting quarterback will be week 1, and they say Joe Flacco. We'll talk about it. Also, speaking of odds, there are a lot of people or a lot of folks who believe Kevin Stefanski should have the highest odds or some of the highest odds to be the first coach fired this year. I'll push back on that. And Ben Roethlisberger, yes, former Steelers, likely Hall of Fame to be quarterback, is lying about the Browns. I do want to thank you for being in every day at the Locked On Browns podcast, making us your first listen every single day. Remember, you can find Cleveland Browns content with Locked On Browns every week, Monday through Friday, guaranteed, with bonus content on some weekends as well. And it's totally free to you. Just hit that subscribe button wherever it is that you get your podcasts. And of course, at the Locked On Browns YouTube channel, where you can also get involved in the show by sharing your thoughts on anything we discussed today in the comments section. This is your team, so be part of the conversation every single day. And yes, our friends at FanDuel have revealed their odds for who will be the Browns starting quarterback week 1, and this is how the list shakes down. It's Joe Flacco leading the pack at minus 102 to be the favorite to win the job. Kenny Pickett is second, naturally so, plus 200 for him. Dylan Gabriel is third, plus 500, and Shedeur Sanders is fourth, plus 870. If you're a big Shedeur Sanders fan like myself, go play those plus 870 odds if you think he has a shot at legitimately winning the starting job going into week 1, because you think he's just that more talented than everybody, and it's going to show through, and they're going to have to start him. Those are some decent odds to try to win a little bit of money if you want to go play it. But regardless, the reason I think this list actually makes a ton of sense, and even though I do fall into that same boat as I was just joking about with Shedeur, where I believe he is the most talented of the group, I wouldn't mind seeing him start week 1. I do think it's actually fair, though, to have Flacco being number 1. Just it makes the most sense based on what we know about this franchise and how they're handling the quarterback situation right now, and what we know about how these guys kind of fit into the Browns offense and what they're trying to do. Like I said, whether you think, like I do, that Shedeur Sanders should be getting a bigger opportunity to start, the team has signaled that they are going to take their time in letting these rookies develop and not putting them out on the field with live bullets flying too soon or too early in their developmental process. They want to slow play it with them. That applies to Dylan Gabriel as well. It's not just Shedeur Sanders, but because of that, having Dylan Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders third and fourth, I understand it, because everything we've seen to this point has signaled that is the pecking order of the depth chart anyway, and frankly, that they aren't going to rush these two guys out there, even though some might want to see that, and I've talked about that. I do think that there's something to be said for, hey, if you start these rookies early and you get a bigger sample size of who they are and what they bring to the table and how they fit in Kevin Stefanski's offense and what they can do, that's better for you for the Browns rather to make a decision then in 2026 on whether or not they have their franchise quarterback or not. And I wouldn't mind that if that happened, even though I guess it would be counterintuitive in some people's eyes to winning, because it would be more than about developing that quarterback rather than just trying to win games. And maybe somebody steals the show. I would love, and I will talk about this, coming up in the next couple weeks or so. I would love for Shedeur Sanders just to ball out where he's like, hey, it's my job. You can't start anybody else, because you said whoever is the best of the 4, I'm the best of 4. And then he makes the decision for them. But based on how they've sort of structured this thing, based on what we've seen during the spring, I think Flacco does make the most sense to go into camp as the leading horse in this race, and in FanDuel's odds to be the starter. Now, we all know what has been said rather about Kenny Pickett. The team views him as their reclamation project and the guy that they can sort of revive his career potentially here. And there's been plenty said about him being maybe the front runner of this group and having the inside track to win the job just because they really like Kenny Pickett and they think that his problems prior to this had to do with the system he was in, the offensive coordinator he had, and it was less about him and more about that, and that they can pull that out of him. And there is something to be said, like, as I've talked about Kevin Stefanski and whether or not he's a quarterback developer, I don't know that we can say he is at this point. We haven't seen it. But I also do think, like, he has gotten some of the best play out of other quarterbacks that were just kind of guys. You know, a Jacoby Brissett, for example, comes to mind. He made Jacoby Brissett look pretty solid for that year that they were working together. And so maybe there's something to be said there with Kenny Pickett. But I still think there's a learning curve for Kenny that isn't there for Flacco. And Flacco knows this offense. He is a 17-year veteran in this league. You know what you're going to get with him. You know what to expect with him. And that's part of the reason why during OTAs and during mandatory minicamp, he didn't take a ton of the reps. He took more during OTAs than he did during minicamp. Minicamp, his day was really like the third day. Day 3 of minicamp was the day where he was running with the ones and doing some stuff and actually getting those 11-on-11 reps. But the rest of it was kind of focused on the rookies and with the ones and the twos, and then Kenny Pickett as well. And so, you know, that speaks to the fact that those guys, that trio, Pickett and the two rookies, are the ones who are still sort of learning the playbook, getting acclimated to what they want to do, the terminology, all those things, where Flacco is the one who knows this playbook already, knows what the expectation is. You don't have to teach Joe Flacco a lot at this juncture of his career. He gets it. He's seen it. And so I think that the fact that the reason he didn't take a lot of those snaps and reps, and the fact that he did kind of stand off on the side a lot during those drills, was because they know what they have in Joe Flacco. They're not worried about getting him the reps right now because they weren't really worried about it. And so that all to me speaks to this FanDuel, the FanDuel odds here being accurate, being what I think the real list should sort of be going into training camp, because I think Flacco should be the lead horse in this race right now. And unless Kenny Pickett changes my mind, and he very well could change my mind when we get to training camp, or if one of the rookies changes my mind, we'll see. We still have to see Shedeur Sanders get those first team reps first. So there's still a lot that has to play out, obviously, with this process, and it could certainly change. But going into training camp, I feel like this is a pretty fair list of odds to be the Browns starter week 1, despite what's been said about Kenny Pickett and the fact that the organization seems to really like him and be leaning into the idea that he could start for them. I do believe that Flacco is probably makes more sense. And I've said this before too, from a standpoint of this team is in a weird phase right now where they're sort of transitioning, they're rebuilding a little bit, but they're also still trying to stay competitive and win. You got veterans on this team like Joe Bitonio and Myles Garrett who are back in the fold and wanting to go out and compete. They don't want to just like throw in the towel on a season, especially for Joe Bitonio. If it's like his last season, he's not going to sign. He wouldn't have signed up for that. So you're trying to still win. And in the grand scheme of things, like Flacco makes the most sense if you're trying to thread that needle of winning while rebuilding, because you don't have to plan long-term around Joe Flacco. He's at the tail end of his career here. But like I said, he also is somebody who makes others around him better. We saw that in 2023. He helped make David Njoku a Pro Bowler. Him and Amari Cooper had a great connection that year. Like, he made Elijah Moore look like a good receiver, probably the receiver that the Browns thought he was going to be when they traded for him. So there's reasons to like Flacco as the starter and on multiple fronts, but on top of him obviously being one of the fan favorites in this group. But I also do think that he gives you the best chance to win now while trying to sort of transition into a rebuilding phase with a lot of young talent that you're hoping can come along pretty quickly here. And so I like where these odds are set by our friends over at FanDuel. Speaking of odds, there are plenty of folks who believe Kevin Stefanski should have some of the highest odds to be the first coach fired this year. Do you agree? Do I agree? I'll tell you why I think that's a little hyperbolic, and we'll talk about it coming up here in the Locked On Browns podcast. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. My wife and I have been trying to get some bigger projects done around the house. Plus, it's the summer. We just got back from our lone vacation that we took this summer, and we needed to look into our financial picture, get a better sense of where our money's going, where we can save money and things that we want to do. And so Monarch Money has made managing our money together as a couple easier than ever before. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. All right, so speaking of odds, we just talked about the odds from FanDuel to be the Browns starting quarterback. There are also a lot of people who believe that Kevin Stefanski should have the highest odds for the first coach to be fired this season. And I think there's some other names that sort of come up or are on my mind in terms of people who would fall into this category. I think Brian Daboll probably falls into this category to a degree. Giants, they drafted Abdul Carter. They drafted Jackson Dart. They kind of are hoping he is their next great quarterback, if you will, but still have questions there. And frankly, I think Brian Daboll was on the hot seat last year, going especially towards the end of the season when things hadn't really gone very well for the Giants. And so I think he certainly is in that conversation. I think Mike McDaniel from the Dolphins is very much in that conversation. Guy who obviously, the Dolphins have underachieved these last couple years with him. I know they made the playoffs the one year, but you built this super team, had Tyreek Hill, all this different stuff, and it didn't work, especially last year. And then you also can maybe throw into the mix even a guy like Zach Taylor with the Bengals. And I think that one actually makes more sense than even Kevin Stefanski if you're talking about just inside the division, because Zach Taylor has Joe Burrow. And that team is expected to do things and go places. They made a Super Bowl run early on in his tenure there with the Bengals. Zach Taylor has already been for years could have talked about, is it him or is it Zach? Is it Joe Burrow that makes the Bengals a good team? And if they don't ascend the way that they should, if they miss the playoffs again as a team that is expected to make the playoffs with a franchise quarterback, I think that he very much is square in the eye of being on the hot seat for coaches that are in this conversation. Now, I understand to a degree where Kevin Stefanski comes into focus with this topic specifically and the idea that he could be the first coach fired. But I think those who think that aren't necessarily in tune with where the Browns are as an organization. I just talked about it last segment. They are trying to thread the needle on being competitive this year, trying to win while also rebuilding a little bit. And anybody who remembers the comments from Jimmy Haslam back in March at the owners' meetings, he alluded to the fact that this regime is going to have time to fix the situation that they find themselves in. Now, the situation they find themselves in, of course, is the Deshaun Watson debacle, the aftermath of that. How are you going to get out of that? How are you going to work around this albatross of a contract that is going to be sort of weighing you down financially for a couple of years, at least a couple more years here, and figure these things out? His comments at the time, Jimmy Haslam's, were that, hey, we took a big swing and a miss, and now we got to dig ourselves out of this hole. That, to me, suggests that they're going to have time to sort of see this thing through, both Stefanski and, frankly, Andrew Berry. And he talked about this draft being an important one and the next two drafts being an important one, that they're not going to force the issue on trying to find a franchise quarterback this year if they don't think the guy's there, because they want to set themselves up to maybe find that guy maybe next year. So those comments did not sound like somebody who is just going to jump the gun and be like, hey, you're getting fired. Whether you agree that Kevin Stefanski should be here still, should be the first coach fired if things go awry, whatever, or not, Jimmy Haslam seems to see it differently. And I can understand where he's coming from if they all sort of put their heads together on the Deshaun decision and it came down to Haslam being like, hey, you know what? We're going to throw money at a problem here and see if we can get it to work. And it didn't. Like, I can understand where he's like, you guys get a mulligan because I also had a role in this, and let's try to figure this thing out because I still trust you guys. And so, yeah, like the things can obviously change. If the team looks lifeless late in the season, if the team quits on Kevin Stefanski, and I always point to that as a big thing, like your team can't quit on you. You can't lose your voice in that locker room and expect to keep your job. And if that's how it plays out with Stefanski, where guys are like, yeah, we just don't really feel like we resonate with the coach anymore. Like that is the biggest red flag as to why you probably need to move on from a guy. So if they win 3 games again or less, and guys just look like they don't care and they're not playing hard for Stefanski anymore, sure, things can obviously change. I don't think you go into the season being like, hey, yeah, you guys are totally safe. But I don't think he's going into it expecting to fire them, because he wants them to see this thing through and see if they can kind of correct it on the other side with at least one more year's worth of a draft, I think, under their belts to do so. And so we'll see how it all plays out, of course. But I do think that the same thing applies to Andrew Berry here. If this if this rookie class flops, I'm not predicting that, but if it does, then sure, he could be on the hot seat as well. Same way Kevin Stefanski could if it's a just miserable season and guys look like they quit. But as things stand right now, I think both of them, Stefanski and Berry, are due back beyond this season, barring a disaster, and we'll have this year and next year to find that franchise quarterback. Maybe they already did. Maybe he's already on this roster, and they're going to see how that all sort of shakes out. Or maybe coming in the 2026 draft, and then they'll reassess, where they're at after the 2026 season and decide if they need to move on from their coach or their GM or both or whatever. So that's how I think this ultimately is going to sort of shake out here. And I don't know, because of that I see Kevin Stefanski being worthy of some of the highest. Maybe worthy is the wrong word, because I think there is an argument to be made like, hey, if you have another 3-14 season, anybody should be on the chopping block, of course. But as we talk about coaches with maybe the best odds, that should have the best odds to be canned the first this season, I don't think Kevin Stefanski really falls in that conversation. And here's the other thing. Even if you think Kevin Stefanski could get fired by the end of the season, I don't think that decision comes mid-season. I think Jimmy Haslam has moved beyond the mid-season firing thing. I don't think he jumps the gun on that anymore, unless it was like a complete disaster and Kevin Stefanski did something unhinged or whatever, which would never happen. That's just not Kevin Stefanski. You know Kevin Stefanski well enough at this point as a fan of this team to know he's not going to do something absolutely absurd or ridiculous or crazy and sabotage himself in that way. But I do think he'd be patient with it. Even if it's another 3-win season, it's playing out in real time. I think it would be, you get to the end of the season, then they fire Stefanski, and then they kind of go from there. Again, but I ultimately don't think it's going to happen anyway. I think they're going to be patient with this, both in the immediate, this season as things stand, but also in the thought process behind whether or not they're going to move on from anybody or not. So we'll see what it all looks like. We'll see how it all shakes out. But I think right now I would bet against Kevin Stefanski being the one of the favorites to be fired first this season. It would stun me if that happened, even if things get off to a rough start, because I just don't think that's the way Jimmy Haslam's operating from what his previous history, but also just right now with this current roster and the way it's constructed and the way the team's built and the guys he has in power. He wants them to get an opportunity to dig themselves out of this hole, as he said. And I think he's willing to give them at least another year, 2026, to do it, so long as they don't completely lose the team in the locker room and all those different things. So that's my read on it. Ben Roethlisberger, yes, former Steelers legend, future Hall of Famer. He's full of it when it comes to one conversation he had recently about the Cleveland Browns. We'll talk about it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Epicor. Every team knows the value of hard work and taking pride in what you build and practicing every detail to get the best results. But no one player, no matter how amazing, can do it all alone. Working together makes getting the win easier. At Epicor, the all-stars are the hardworking manufacturers and distributors who create and deliver the things we all need, from aerospace to electrical to medical devices. Epicor ERP solutions are created by industry experts to help make every day easier. Seeing your whole supply chain is easier. Managing logistics is easier. Responding to price changes is easier. From small businesses with big dreams to growing enterprises with a global vision, we'll equip you with the right tools to move forward, think ahead, and lead the way. Because as the clock ticks down, you need to make the most of every hardworking minute. Easier doesn't cut corners. Easier finds the lane. Discover your success at www.easierwithepicor.com. That's www.easierwithepicor.com. All right, so Ben Roethlisberger is full of crap, and the reason I say that is he was on a recent episode of his podcast, Footballin', and he took a shot at the Browns. And listen, one team over the course of your career, you kind of earn the bragging rights, so you get to take shots, I guess, at your own leisure whenever you feel. And so I get why he's doing this. I get what he's saying. And I get that he kind of has the ultimate bragging rights. But at the end of the day, I find these quotes sort of laughable considering other quotes that he's had about the situation of where he could have potentially played for the Cleveland Browns. Now, he was asked about like the culture. He was talking about the culture of the Browns. And he said, it'd be hard for me to fit into Cleveland because, and he paused, I win. And he sort of cracked a smile. He said, I'm sorry, just joking. He wanted to clarify, but I don't know that he was fully joking if you say that on a podcast and you know it's going to get traction and you know what you're doing there, basically, if you make a comment like that. And the reason I push back on these comments, and I think that he's full of it, is that we know Ben Roethlisberger, because he's also been documented saying this, but like this next part of this before, that he thought there was a good chance he was going to end up with the Browns. He thought the Browns were going to take him, or that there was a good chance the Browns were going to take him. And he said that on another episode of his podcast back in 2019, I think it was, or however many years ago, where he said, I thought for sure I'd have a chance to go there, talking about the Browns. Glad I didn't. Thought I was, and when they didn't, I was like, really? I'm from Ohio, and you have a chance to take me, and you didn't? All right, I'll beat you 30 times or 30-something times. He almost did beat the Browns 30-something times. He came up 4 games shy of doing so, and he did miss some over the course of his career due to injury and whatnot. But that's beside the point. Those comments are basically, though, like contradictory to each other. Saying, I wouldn't have fit with the Browns because, I win. Which, again, tongue-in-cheek to a degree, but also you're saying it on a platform like that where it's going to get it picked up. I think there was some spite in there. There was some shots fired, if you will. And so I don't buy that he was fully joking. And because of that, like, I just go back to the earlier comments about how he thought he was going to be potentially a Cleveland Brown. And I find it hard to believe that he wouldn't have loved to play in Cleveland. A guy who's from Ohio. But by the way, he would have relished it. Ben Roethlisberger would have totally relished being the guy from Ohio who turned around the franchise that couldn't get out of their own way, couldn't solidify the quarterback position. Like, they had just gotten back in 99 to 2004 was pretty much, other than the year they made the playoffs and lost to the Steelers. It had basically been a disaster. And think about it. Like, if they had gotten Ben Roethlisberger, the quarterback, like, we would talk about the Browns quarterback situation completely differently today than we did all those years that Roethlisberger was just dominating the Browns for the Pittsburgh Steelers. It is kind of an interesting what if, history scenario that could have played out if the Browns had pulled the trigger on Ben Roethlisberger. But him saying that he thought there was a chance he could go there, and being like a son of Ohio who thought there was a chance and at least felt somewhat slighted when they didn't take him, to think to himself like, hey, I'm going to try to beat you 30-something times instead. Like, I get why you would feel that way. I get why not being selected by a team from Ohio that you thought you could have been chosen by served as motivation for him to go out and try to beat them as much as he joked about beating them. And it's the key part of that other quote from several years ago. Like, I get all that, but to act like he wouldn't have, to make light of the idea that like, well, hey, I wouldn't have fit in because I win. Dude, like, you would have absolutely embraced being part of this organization, trying to be the quarterback that turned it around. And there are other, like, Baker Mayfield came in the same way when he was drafted by the Browns. He was like, if they draft me, I'd be honored to try to turn their franchise around and finally be that quarterback for them. That's exactly how I envision Ben Roethlisberger would have handled that. It's the exact same thing that some have already started sort of teasing with Drew Aller in next year's draft, being from Northeast Ohio, being the hometown kid who can maybe bring relevance and success to the organization. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I'm not saying that that's the best case scenario, because I also know there's a lot of people who would be worried about Drew Aller coming to Cleveland with all those expectations. And it was the same sort of conversation with Mitch Trubisky all those years ago when he was potentially on the table for the Browns and they ended up taking Myles Garrett instead, which was the right move. Like, hey, is it too much pressure to be from this area and try to turn this franchise around that's never been able to get this position right for so long? Like, is that too much on Drew Aller? But it's the same conversation we're talking about. And anybody who's from this area, anybody who's from Ohio that would be drafted by the Browns would absolutely embrace the idea, I would think for the most part, of being the quarterback to fix that franchise. And Ben Roethlisberger is no different at all. So him joking about this, him saying like, I wouldn't have fit in because I'm a winner and whatever else he wants to say, I get it's a fun little pot shot on a podcast. But I wholeheartedly push back on that notion, because I know deep down in his heart of hearts, Ben Roethlisberger would have embraced and relished being the quarterback of this football team and trying to have the career he had for the Steelers for the Browns and turning them into a reputable franchise rather than having to feel like he had to beat them 30 times a year. It worked out for Pittsburgh, didn't work out for the Browns. But to act like all these years later, you wouldn't have loved that outcome and that you wouldn't have made the most of it and that you still couldn't have been a winner in it had you gotten drafted here, I think is laughable. Another episode down with you, Dog Pound. Thank you for joining me as always to talk about your favorite football team. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make Locked On Browns your first listen every day. Back to 5 episodes a week next week, starting Monday. And we're going to do some position group breakdowns. We're going to talk about the quarterbacks. We're going to talk about why I think Shedeur Sanders is going to have a better training camp and preseason than Dylan Gabriel. We'll get into all those things and more. So again, hit that subscribe button. And for your second listen, check out Locked On NFL Scouting, or keep it local. Check out Locked On Cavs or Locked On Guardians. Thank you for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network. I will talk to you again real soon, Cleveland. See you.